Hi, everyone.
Right.
Yeah, so in today's webinar, we will be looking at getting future ready, especially everybody's moving to the cloud. So how do we accelerate the growth by moving into cloud and using most of the Microsoft Azure services that are currently available, but not forgetting that with the latest advancement in AI, how can we use things like generative AI and prompt engineering also in order to do that? And how you can take some of your monolithic applications that you currently have and move that effectively to the cloud. So I'll be talking with David and Banu, who has worked on different projects with different aspects of this, and just have a casual conversation to understand what the experience has been, what they have learned from this, and what we can do. Now, most customers are looking for either cost savings or making things easier to manage, because the idea is that you move to the cloud, you don't have to worry about infrastructure. The cloud is easy to maintain, but most importantly, it's easy to scale. But there are, there might be conceptions about certain things, but what is a reality? And those are the kind of things we would like to discuss in today's session with the two experts that we have here. So first and foremost, looking at monolithic applications, most organizations have built monolithic .NET applications in the past. And when you think about moving to the cloud, it is not an easy thing. We have gone through that journey, and we have helped a lot of customers with that journey. So David, what do you think has been one of the major challenges for you or the customers you work with when you're moving one of these monolithic applications? What are the things you should be looking at first of all?
Yeah, I think initially, I think it's really important to understand why you want to move to the cloud. I mean, I've worked on the numerous projects where we've converted sort of monolithic or legacy systems into sort of an Azure environment, and often there's different reasons behind wanting to do that. I mean, in some cases it is scalability, as you mentioned before. Systems are perhaps running on old hardware and are slow, or aren't able to cope with extra users or extra load that's built up over the years. So scalability is often a driving force for that. Sometimes it's legacy systems or legacy technology. I've worked on systems which have been sort of ASP based, and there's security vulnerabilities have crept in. So there's often several different driving factors for moving into the cloud. I think it's important at the very early stages of a project to understand exactly why we're moving to the cloud, and that will help drive decisions about what sort of technology you want to use, which bit perhaps needs to be refactored, and how it can deal with important issues like security and scalability.
Okay, so what should people be thinking about when they want to move? What are the first steps? Do they re-architect the entire application to make it cloud native? Or is it better to first take it to the cloud, like migrate and then modernize? What has been the best approach in your experience?
I think in my experience, an iterative approach to getting an application to the cloud is always going to be best. I've seen approaches where it's been a bit of a big bang approach, and it's the name suggests it was a bit of a big bang. I think to be able to gradually move components into the cloud, whether it's effectively recreating your infrastructure in the cloud in terms of VMs as a first step, I think is a good approach to gradually move towards that goal of having a cloud application. I think doing that, you'd be able to progressively move towards your goal and deliver benefits to customers earlier in the project, rather than waiting a huge amount of time before delivering something which you're not 100% sure is going to work correctly.
Yeah,
so
I think that's quite important what you said about progressively moving towards the goal, because moving the workload straight into the cloud, you start seeing the benefits of some of the things. For example, trying to scale things out. Those kind of things can be achieved without any major re-architecting, because re-architecting a product is not that simple. You need the right resources, the right expertise, and it takes a lot of time, and you might not see the benefits quick. But migrating the workload and making sure it is in the cloud makes it accessible, and in many cases even transactable on things like Microsoft Azure Marketplace. So you already open up some of the capabilities of that application to end users, who previously wouldn't have known about those applications. So with that migration, once that you're migrated onto the cloud, what are the next things that you typically would be doing in order to modernize it?
One of the first things I look at is to try and assess the different components or different functional areas within a system. Often they can be very different in terms of the requirements, particularly in terms of scalability. I've worked on a product before, which was a payroll system, where for most of the month it wasn't really used much. It was just sort of general admin. But then at the end of the month, there was also a huge amount of processing and publishing of information to HMRC. So there's very different usage patterns from other systems. So one of the things I did to look at the scalability and functionality around the actual processing engine, and look at the scalability of that separately from, say, the web UI components. So I think it's important to really do deep analysis of the system, identify different areas of the system which are have discrete functionality, and try and consider those separate components. And over time, you can gradually sort of break those up into potentially to microservices, making use of things like Kubernetes services or container apps, to give additional scalability, while still maintaining the integrity of the system.
Okay. Now, you mentioned a couple of the names of services like Kubernetes and so on. Now, when you talk of Azure, there's a plethora of services available within Azure, and sometimes it could be quite confusing for someone who is new to cloud computing or even Azure. There are things like the compute services, there's for applications, there's things for managing events, databases, other AI-related services. There are so many of these things. Now, if someone wants to, if you take those two scenarios where you want to first migrate and then modernize. So when you're first migrating, what are the typical services that you would look at?
I think probably the typical starting points would be VMs. I mean, I mentioned earlier about effectively recreating your environment in the cloud, that you can install the same software as it is now, but in the cloud. I think that's probably a good starting point to at least get something into the cloud that you can work on.
Okay.
I think Azure App Services are very good as a sort of generic web application. But in terms of breaking up the system into small components, we'll probably start to be looking at things like function apps, and mentioned about container apps and Kubernetes clusters. But they probably come a bit later on in the process, where we actually start to refactor some of the code if it's required, to containerize them and get them into those sort of separate components.
So David, what you just mentioned is that so customers can start looking at the simple workloads like Azure VMs, which will help you to move the applications to the cloud pretty much as it was working within your local data centers. And then from there, you can start introducing some of the cloud capabilities like, let's say, scalability. So in this case, you could use an Azure VM scale set and just use the same set of VMs, but then scale it out on demand and then scale it down when the demand is low. So it already starts to give you some cost benefits of having the hardware infrastructure up and running only when needed. And then you mentioned how you can then look at other services where you're changing the architecture, let's say, into more of a microservices architecture, which then starts using maybe Azure functions, the web apps, or even for those who really want to go really into the proper containerization, use things like the Kubernetes services and so on. So there are different, the learning curve is different for different things. And the more you get comfortable with the cloud native architecture, you can start then modernizing those apps and really start making use of the cloud capabilities with the new workloads. Yeah. I would like to now go to Banu. So Banu, I know you've been working on some very interesting with some very interesting customers, and one thing that everybody's now talking about is ChatGPT. Everybody knows about ChatGPT, although they might not really understand what is actually happening behind the scene, what GPT is, but everybody knows about it. With all the hype, do you think a technology like GPT-4 that's been introduced is that really going to help enterprises, or is this just for the consumers to have some fun with?
Yeah, Rakesh, that's a really interesting question. I think that's the million-dollar question, and everybody's trying to grapple with that. How can we utilize the generative AI technologies to have that edge over our competitors, or get to market quickly, or refine our product, refactor our product, etc. What David mentioned about getting from A to B for organizations. So all those tasks need some grunt work to do. Say maybe from DevOps, maybe from developers, or a refactoring, or a bit of reorganizing your functional code, etc. So I've been working with the organization where I've started using the GitHub Copilot more actively than ChatGPT, maybe for question and answers, or kind of assessing what kind of results I will get for given scenario. So in particular with this in this use case where I have been asked for an estimate. I mean, your product owner comes to you saying, I want this X feature to be developed. How long is it going to take? Then maybe your general just starts running it through your brain. You say this step, that step, and so on, and you add that all up and say, oh, that will take probably 4 weeks for me or the team to get that delivered. So I think here it's where the role of generative AI comes into play, where you could start thinking about which parts in these steps I can automate or I can generate, as opposed to, let's say, build from scratch. How can I refine the existing steps? Is there some tools I can use to understand this easily or quickly without having to spend hours and hours understanding something? So I would say broadly, those are the kind of areas where we've been using generative AI, GitHub Copilot to build scaffolding code, help give suggestions, identify the edge cases. Say, for instance, if you have built something and you haven't come across an edge case, and synthesis, building different synthesis, what they call the terminology which is used as various synthesis of a certain solution. So yeah, definitely the hype is there, but
Okay.
yeah, there is that utility is there too.
So Banu, you mentioned about GitHub Copilot. So what exactly is that? So what is Copilot? Because most people would have heard about Copilot being Microsoft using that terminology quite a lot, with Copilot coming in for their Dynamics suite or for their Office product, M365 product. There's a lot of Copilot. People are hearing about it. So what exactly is GitHub Copilot?
A GitHub Copilot is a, I think, AI-driven tool which one can use within the IDE, say Visual Studio Code, or the IDE of your choice. And as you type in ChatGPT the commands, say for instance, you write something, give me XYZ, you can start writing that in the code in the IDE itself. And there are some shortcuts to open up the Copilot screen where it will give you the results, and you can pick the results from there and then add it in your code. In the same way, you can select a piece of code and you can analyze that using Copilot, again, some shortcut commands to do those. So it's a built-in feature within the workflow, not as in you have to go elsewhere and ask and then make, remember to save it, etc. It's actually a built-in feature.
With this integration with your IDE, does it work with any kind of IDE? Does it work with any programming language, or do people need to be restricted to a certain type of programming?
I think it works on most of the major programming languages. In fact, different libraries as well. So quite recently, I worked with Tailwind UI. So in our product, we weren't using that elsewhere. So suddenly we were given that we start using Tailwind UI, build this using Tailwind UI. The generative AI helped us to shortcut lots of those steps. So yeah, and in terms of IDE, yeah, it works with, I think, JetBrains tools. It works with various other IDEs which are out there.
Okay, that's good. Now, given AI is generally trained on the data available worldwide and on the internet, with all the code written by good developers as well as bad developers. What is your take on the output that generally something like a Copilot would produce? Is this where you think experts like you are needed to do that final level of validation, or can you completely rely on something that the Copilot just produces and take that to production?
Yeah. Obviously, we can't rely on it completely. It will give us the prompts. It will give us answers to questions, and we have to stitch them together to build a solution. So you would need to have that full understanding of how an application needs to be built, what is good and what's not good, and the comparison. And also another thing I want to stress there is that how you prompt gets you the results, and what is your context of how when you're building something. So the AI tools, they remember what you asked before and what you're asking now, so it will start to navigate you in a certain way. So yeah, those are I think the key skills we are seeing that more and more becomes the differentiator, say, between maybe a classic developer versus a AI developer going forward.
Okay, so yeah, what you're saying is the prompt is an important part, and just like we're seeing with standard ChatGPT questions, your results are only be as good as the prompt is. So for the prompts for your GitHub Copilot, does it require a lot of background knowledge about software development? What level of expertise is typically needed in order for you to generate an enterprise level code out of it?
I think I would say a fair level of knowledge, intermediate level to a high intermediate level of knowledge, only for the reason that you're validating what has been given to you, and understanding. So, and in my experience, the more time is taken to write the code than to understand. So you can probably quickly understand, so on. So we are shortening the time. We're not replacing somebody's with a low capability with an AI tool and making them highly capable. Whereas what we're saying is, oh, you've got a bigger task to do. Here is a tool which can shrink that task down into a shorter time frame, which will impact on elsewhere in your pipeline. So that's where personally I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important point, because most people might be worried that would AI replace human beings? And the reality is, no, it can't. What it is doing is it's making the humans more efficient. So cutting down on time where it's not needed, and giving you something that you can straight away work on, and then use your expertise to take it to the next level, which can then go into production. So that's a really useful thing, which you have highlighted. Yeah. So would prompt engineering itself be an important part of software engineering?
I would say yes. Yeah, prompt engineering is becoming more and more a key to how your workflow, how your let's say development workflow is built in these days. So it's getting more and more important, understanding how tokenization works, how the grammar works generally, how you structure a question, and how you do a follow-up questions, and so on. So yes, I definitely think that there is a case for having a prompt engineer capability on top of all your other capabilities, which will make you a better developer, productive, I guess.
Okay, no, that's interesting. And if you were to look into a crystal ball and see how is development going to look like in the future, or rather how are applications going to look like? I know it's a very difficult question, but if you think about it, many years ago, when the user interfaces, the whole UX used to be very keyboard driven with your tabbing and things, and then later mouse came in and the whole interface started to change. And with the advent of tablets, that changed even further, where everybody was just swiping things and zooming in. So the interaction with your software has changed dramatically over the last many years. And with this huge change with AI and that interaction on almost like a human level, do you think that's going to change the whole user interfaces for applications? What do you think might happen?
I don't think that the user interface perhaps is going to remain the same. People would like to talk to a bot instead of going through a big article, say for instance. So maybe when you go on a website, it will be more useful to have a search or just chat to this bot, and they will not only answer you the questions, they will do the tasks for you. They will do everything else which is needed, and also if you want, they can describe you something, play videos, and so on. So I would say that will become integral to how we let's say consume information, or look at websites, etc. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks, Banu and David, for enlightening me and everyone else on your journey and how the whole cloud migration and the cloud modernization of applications in the cloud, how this has helped not only what you are doing, but also helped organizations, other organizations. It's interesting to see how there is a lot of capability in the cloud. There are a lot of opportunities and options to get there, and a lot of modern ways of doing that. But a lot of the customers would be concerned, sometimes worried, is that even a viable journey for them? And what we have seen with our own experience and what we have done for other customers, it's not a very daunting journey. There are very simple ways to take this forward, to approach this. There is a lot of support from cloud providers like Microsoft. There's a lot of help in Azure, but then we can apply our own experience and help others. So if you're an ISV or any organization that is planning to modernize your application, take this to the cloud, then we are there to help you with our experiences and everything that we have learned on this journey. So not just the hype, but true experiences that we can share and take you on that journey along with us.